Well, the man who wanted to be Vice President of the United States, Tim Waltz, is still struggling to accept the election loss, this time criticising Americans for rejecting wokeism.
We were pledging to be inclusive. We were pledging to bring people in. Donald Trump has said that that isn't what he wants. And so if that's what America's leaning towards, I guess for me, it's to understand and learn more about America.
And the man who has become the most bitter Democrat, Barack Obama, echoed that statement.
The election proved that democracy is pretty far down on people's priority list.
Joining us now is host of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, Brad Palumbo. Brad, look, why can't America be so kind as to accept this wokeism?
They're just insufferable, honestly. I mean, Tim Walz there, that's an extremely polite way of saying that, oh, we lost because America is just racist and bigoted and intolerant, and they voted for the guy who was all of those things and not us because we're wonderful and amazing. It's actually a little more complicated than that, and it should cause a little bit of self-reflection or self-awareness that Donald Trump picked up massive gains with minority voters. So clearly the problem wasn't voters hating inclusivity and wanting to go back to 1900 or whatever. And Barack Obama, I mean, maybe it's not that people don't care about democracy. It's that they think the Democrats are frauds when it comes to this. Their candidate was anointed, not elected, in Kamala Harris. They've actively been hypocritical on everything they say they stand for when it comes to democracy and the 2020 election. They've even funded many of the candidates they've criticized when it's helpful for them in primary elections. I think it's more that people are fed up with that talking point because they don't really buy it from anybody than it is that they just don't care about democracy at all. It's also just true that things like the border and inflation were more top of mind for people, but that again might have something to do with how poorly Democrats have handled those issues.
Well, Brad, I want to pick you up on that point about the Democrats' disdain for democracy, because a lot of people were critical of the decision to make Kamala Harris the Democratic Party's candidate without a primary. For one, it was anti-democratic, and for two, a primary might have unearthed a better Democratic candidate, but Kamala's deputy campaign manager has said they couldn't hold an open primary because Kamala would have lost and black women would have been upset.
But to open up a Democratic primary, you would have had black women, who were the strongest voting bloc for Kamala Harris, be highly upset if it was not Kamala Harris.
Brad, is that not a clear admission that for the Democratic Party, DEI is more important than democracy?
They just said the quiet part out loud. I mean, wow. Honestly, that's a stunning admission. He basically just admitted that they gave Kamala Harris the nomination because of DEI concerns, not merit, which, to be clear, is something we did kind of already know. Biden announced this when he picked her as vice president, that he was only considering women and strongly considering a woman of color. I just think the whole thing is condescending and insulting to black women, to just all Americans, all Democrats, that actually, I think most of them don't believe in that. Most of them do believe in just traditional American values of meritocracy and competition and would just vote for whoever they thought was best. Ironically, actually, in the 2020 Democratic primary, black voters didn't support Kamala Harris. They supported Joe Biden, the old white dude who seemed somewhat moderate and not a total loony lefty. So I don't know if they actually know what they're talking about on this, but yeah, the way that Democratic elites view racial minorities in this country is totally out of touch. And I think it showed with the electoral shifts we saw in the election.
Yeah, you're not wrong at that. Now, look, the joyless Joy Reid over at MSNBC, she really never ceases to amaze. You just never know what she will say next. But this time she's compared not giving gender-altering hormones to minors to Nazi Germany.
It is an age-old tradition, which Nazi Germany did with brutally violent ends in the 1930s. While the Supreme Court refuses to do anything about weapons of war in schools, today they seemed inclined to uphold Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care for minors. While the decision is not expected for months, a majority of the justices parroted a string of debunked talking points, all under the guise of protecting the kids, just not every kid.
Brad, how does she come up with this stuff? No wonder her ratings have tanked.
It's so delusional and hysterical. I mean, this MSNBC anchor actually just compared opposing child sex changes to Nazi Germany. I don't know. I think it's actually profoundly insulting to victims of the Holocaust and to the Jewish people to throw that around like candy on Halloween and in the process dilute the memory of such a grave and serious allegation and accusation. They clearly have gone down this path of the boy who cried wolf. And that's why I think a lot of people don't believe the mainstream media, don't believe progressives or Democratic politicians when they throw around these accusations and allegations. Even on the rare instances they maybe actually correctly identified something bigoted or bad, no one listens to them anymore, and it's their own fault because they're so ridiculous and hyperbolic all the time.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. I want to talk about Joe Biden for a moment. He led the traditional White House Christmas tree lighting ceremony on Thursday, but it wasn't the tree, it was Biden's hair that became the talking point. Brad, give me your thoughts on this photo of the US president that has gone viral. He looks like Ebenezer Scrooge after having just seen all three ghosts of Christmas past.
Gosh, there's two things here, right? On one hand, it feels like elder abuse. It feels terrible what they've done to this guy. He's clearly so far past it. It's been apparent for such a long time, and they exploited him to cling to power. They until the last possible second thought he could potentially beat Trump, so they were willing to put up somebody who's clearly past it. But on the other hand, it's also scary that this is the guy who it's 1:30 in the morning right now here in Michigan in the US. A crisis could unfold and the president could be expected to roll out of bed in the middle of the night. Does anyone really think this guy would be sharp and able to make a tough decision with the advice of generals with 5 minutes with a nuclear alert coming in? Of course not. So it's petrifying, honestly. You can say a lot of things about Donald Trump, but at least he's sharper and more with it than this. That's a low bar.
He looks like that guy from Back to the Future. It's just shocking. Now, look, in more proof that Jill Biden, aka Dr. Jill, voted for Donald Trump despite the Democrats for ousting her husband, here they are all buddy-buddy. Have a look at this at the reopening of Notre Dame in France, having a little chat, Brad. Maybe Trump isn't Hitler or a dictator after all.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because on one hand, I actually give the Democrats a little bit of credit on this. They've been fairly civil and respectable about the transition of power, and they've extended an olive branch to Trump. Biden had him at the White House, and all of that I like. That's the approach to politics I want to see in America. But on the other hand, it's like, hold up. 5 minutes ago, you guys were telling us this guy is literally Hitler, and now you're doing photo ops and smiling and shaking his hand and welcoming him and all this stuff. If you had actually believed any of that, I don't think that's how you would be handling this. So it suggests to me, on one hand, that they are being civil for once, which I do appreciate, but on the other hand, that they're rhetorical frauds in many ways. But then again, we kind of knew that.
We knew that indeed. Brad Palumbo, you do it every week. Thanks for helping us make sense of the United States.
Guys.
This